Okay, so you can see this is land and ocean temperature departure from average. And this design or this map was made January 2015, so not very long ago. And what's happening on the global side is parts of the Earth are actually warmer than normal in what they've been in the past, and other parts of the world are cooler than normal, okay? And a lot of this is due to ocean currents. So the Pacific Ocean is the largest water body on the Earth. And of course, the water travels across the equator and warms up. It hits Asia and it bounces back. And if you look at the sort of left side of the screen around Alaska here, that hot water goes up and the hot winds above it. And then they peel down the west coast of North America. You know, they sort of hit Alaska, hit the bight there, and then they move back down. And so you can see that the whole west coast from Alaska all the way down to California is hotter than normal. And again, the ocean currents there are hotter than normal. And one of the important things for us is that if you look at the Bering Strait, this little open water area that goes into the Canadian Arctic, it's bright, bright red. It's very, very hot. So that means that warm water and that warm air is moving into the Canadian Arctic. And if you look over here, I have colleagues working on the other side of the map in Russia. And you can see in the Chuktuk area here of Russia, it's some of the hottest parts of the world. And again, this is related to that part of the world. So I'm working with Russians there, and they've got a narrow strip of Arctic there, of Arctic tundra. And that area is going to disappear real fast. But we have, in our Arctic, we have a really big Canadian Arctic tundra, the islands and the mainland Arctic tundra there. So, and the winds move from west to east. So in effect, what's happening is that the western part of North America, as you see, is all above temperature. And if you've read the news, they've had forest fires and drought all the way from California up to Alaska. And these fires are bigger. They're thousands and thousands of acres. They're bigger, they're more intense, and they're more frequent. And so that part of the world is, in effect, overheating and burning. In contrast to that, when this wind goes through the Bering Sea, and the cold Arctic air has to go somewhere. So it's pushed, and where does it push? It pushes down through Hudson Bay. You can see that this eastern central part of North America and Canada are colder than normal. We just had snow a few days ago here in Sudbury and Toronto. And, you know, we're having late springs. And this is because that cold Arctic air has to go somewhere. So where most of us live, it's colder than normal, okay? So if you look at the forest fires that are here in, like under James Bay in that part of Ontario, I mean, the fire cycle there is like once every 250 years, you're gonna get a fire, and it's gonna be a small fire, not so intense, it's very wet there. It's sort of mainly spruce and wet spruce bog. So that area is not going to burn, you know, to the same extent as the West. But Western Ontario, like the western part of north of Thunder Bay in that area, the fires there is affected by the hot air off the prairies. And so we have in the Western Ontario boreal system, bigger fires, again, more intense fires and more frequency fires. So in Western Ontario, we're gonna have a fire cycle every 67 years, you're gonna have major fires. Whereas under James Bay in the east, we're gonna have fires maybe every 200 to 300 years. Okay, so what this is going to affect is the vegetation. So, you know, we have what we call early and late successional habitat, and that's going to affect the ungulates that are there, whether you have moose there or whether you have woodland caribou there. So basically what's happening is that with the fire, we're creating early successional habitat, which is birch and poplar and willow and alder. That's moose food. So Western Ontario is going to get increasingly more and more moose. And I remember when I was at the conference in Thunder Bay, there was a chap from Pewanik, and he was saying they're finally seeing moose in Pewanik. They're getting moose in Pewanik, which before was all caribou area, right? And when I talked to Jerry Racy, recently retired caribou biologist from M&R out of Thunder Bay, he said the Penn Island herd, which was right on the Manitoba Ontario border, has now moved over to Cape Henrietta and Maria, where it's colder. And so there's been a major shifts there in the ungulates there. So basically, because of fire and drought, in Western Ontario, my view, and this is my personal view, is we're going to get more and more moose. It's going to be more and more moose habitat because it's creating this early successional birch poplar environment. And we're going to get more and more moose. And then in the eastern part of Ontario, say Cape Henrietta, Maria, and Ontario eastern part, where it's colder than normal, the caribou are still going to make it as long as we don't cut down the forest and make it early successional, because that's the other factor influencing it is forestry, where you cut down the forest and then you got deciduous coming in, birch and poplar, and that sort of thing. So as far as what I consider the primary protein source, and this is related to food safety and sustainability for our First Nation people in the North, all our people in the North actually, this is going to be a major shift in sort of the ungulates that are available for these communities. And I did some work a number of years ago up in Red Lake, Eark Falls area, and I had a grad student, David Witchar. And at that time, the south of town, they had clear cut. And north of town was still boreal forest, like conifers, birch, and it was like conifers, pine, and spruce with lots of lichen, ground lichen, and lots of arboreal lichen. And south of town, where they had clear cut, within 7 years, it was loaded with moose. We were collecting wolves, actually and we're looking at the stomachs of wolves, what was in that area. So all the wolves in the south of the town, after 7 years, there was no caribou left in south of town. It was all moose and was, I think, one white-tailed deer in the stomachs of one wolf. So major change south of Eark Falls, Red Lake. North of there, where they had conifer and all the lichens in the conifer forest, was still caribou country. So the wolves in the south end got bigger and the packs got bigger, and north of town, the wolves were smaller. And so the size of the wolves and the size of the pack, which is predation, which is the other factor influencing how many ungulates you have available for yourselves, is, you get big wolves coming in with the moose, and the caribou then become really susceptible to predation, and they disappear. 7 years, they were gone in the southern part of Eark Falls and Red Lake area. North of town was still lots of caribou, woodland caribou, and the wolves were smaller, the packs were smaller, so the caribou were still, sustainable in that particular area. So we have this relationship, one from the plants, which is you change the plants that are in the system, you're going to change the ungulate in the system. If it's early successional, birch and poplar, you got moose there. And north there, if you've got conifer forest with lichens, you're going to have caribou. And I think in the northern part of Ontario, caribou have been the mainstay of most of those populations, communities that are up there. One of the things David did when he was working with some of the First Nation communities in the Red Lake area, and one of the stories he told me is he talked to one of the elders, and I don't know what the name of what the community was, but she was in her 80s, and she says she remembers when her grandfather shot the very first moose in her community when she was a young child, and everybody wondered what it was because they'd been totally functional on caribou before that. And also she says we didn't like the taste of moose compared to caribou, so caribou was clearly preferred in that community at that time. But of course, as the forest industry is clear cut continually northward, the moose have followed them northward, and as we create these early successional habitats, and the fire will do the same. So my view is over the next 50 years, probably in the eastern part of Ontario, if we don't cut it down, the caribou will be sustained. And, so if you look at the communities around James Bay, Attawapiskat, Fort 7, and so on, not Fort 7, but those communities, Cache, and so on, caribou will still be, I would think, available there, and moose will be less frequently maybe found along a few rivers like Moose River. But in Western Ontario and the north there, I think it'll switch to moose habitat. Again, just because of the increased production of early successional habitat by fire and possibly by the logging industry. I work with Jerry Racy, and in Ontario, on caribou, and in Ontario, we don't have a caribou policy. Now, policy is like a law. What we have is caribou guidelines. Mm-hmm. So the forest industry has been given these guidelines, which basically say they can cut large areas, but they have to then leave large areas. And they're trying to mimic fire, mm-hmm. Or natural disturbance type of things. But because it's a guideline to the forest companies, they don't have to follow it. It's just right. A recommendation and a guideline. Right. Now, in contrast to that, we have got moose policies. So mm-hmm. in the moose game, there's actual policies, which means it has some legal bite to it. So the province, M&R, I guess through M&R, can go after companies that don't follow the so-called moose policy. So the word policy means it has some legal teeth in it. The word guidelines means it's nice words, we'd like you to do it, but if you don't do it, we can't slap your hand. You know, so that's where we are with the caribou in the north. The other thing is development is moving north. I was a sort of a caribou specialist when they had the Ring of Fire, when Cliffs Natural Resources was going to develop that. And of course, they wanted to produce a major corridor that runs from where the ore is down to the main railway line, you know, down along Lake Panache, and so on. So, and when I looked at it, they were running, the road would run right on top of an esker, that, you know, gravel ridge that ran from where the ore is down to the rail line, so they could then get the ore out to where it could be smelted or processed. And the caribou herds in the winter were all on top of that esker. They're running the road, and maybe a rail line they were even talking at the time, right down through all these herds, like bing, 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 bing. So again, that's mining, which tends to have less of an impact on presence of caribou or not, than forestry. Forestry, when you clear cut and then you get the deciduous birch and poplar, moose move in, the wolves are bigger, the packs are bigger, and the caribou disappear. So caribou have lost half their range in Ontario, and as the north develops, which I assume it will in part, this is going to be an issue. Caribou are an issue there, and moose maybe do better, or there'll be a switch from one to the other. Our study is not dealing with ticks, but there's some of the people at the University of Guelph Veterinary School have been looking at ticks and Lyme disease and some other types of diseases that move north, and they are predicting they're moving north. In Sudbury here, Christina, we've had the last couple of years, we've had a lot of moose that die in the winter time from ticks. They just have thousands and thousands of ticks around the ears, the mouth, and the neck area, stuff like that, which I think you're relating to, you know, probably similar things. And also the white-tailed deer, they carry what's called brain worm or meninges worm. And this is a small little worm that the deer have, and the deer don't die from it, but they act as a carrier, right? So when white-tailed deer move into the area where there's moose or caribou, and they defecate, so the eggs are in the feces from the deer, and then slugs pick it up, and then, you know, the moose and the caribou accidentally eat a slug when they're eating the vegetation, and then they get it and they die from it because the worm burrows right into the brain and the spinal cord and kills them. So again, brain worm brought in by white-tailed deer. If white-tailed deer move into your area, you're going to have more of the moose and the caribou dying from that. And I would say, you know, the global warming is going to increase the movement of deer north. So then global warming is a factor for sure, which is going to increase the brainworm problem in moose and also caribou if you have them in your area. They did that in Alaska, a number of experiments in Alaska where they had they shot all the wolves in a valley because they wanted to increase, you know, the number of ungulates that hunters could come in and pay a lot of money for. And within 5 years, the wolves were back. Wolves have a very, you know, high reproductive rate, and they're very successful. And so, you know, at best, it would be a temporary thing. And I really don't think it's a valuable thing. Where caribou are, see the size of the wolves, it's mainly the male wolves, is directly related to the size of the prey and the risk associated, the danger of the prey that they take down. So the largest wolves in North America are in Wood Buffalo National Park, and they're specializing on bison. And these are massive. The male wolves, which are the ones that have first contact when you watch wolves go in on a kill, they are, in Wood Bison National Park, they are like 37% heavier than the females, massive. And the packs up there are 18 to 22 wolves in one pack going after a bison, okay? In contrast to that, so you've got all these species, you got bison, you got moose, you got elk, you got, you know, black-tailed deer and white-tailed deer, and you got caribou and bigger caribou, like Perry's caribou is really small, like a beagle dog with long legs, and so on. And we go right down to Mexico, you got the Mexican, the little pig there, the collared peccary. All of these prey are different sizes and represent different risks to the predator. So the big guys, you need to be a big wolf to do a bison, you need to be a smaller wolf to do a deer, and a smaller one to do a peccary in Mexico if you're doing, you know, these little piglets in Mexico. So when we looked at the size of the male wolf that are doing caribou in Ontario, the male wolves are about 12% heavier than their females. Bison wolves are 37% heavier than the females, right? And so wherever we have caribou, we've got wolves that are the appropriate size. And in that scenario, they're going to tend to take the animals that are either sick or the animals that are, you know, genetically dysfunctional in some way or get unlucky. So generally the wolves sort of keep, you know, like if you read the wolf literature, half the literature says wolves are good. They take out the sick animals, the genetically dysfunctional animals, and they keep the herd healthy. The other 50% of the papers over the last 100 years say wolves will kill all the animals, doesn't matter whether they're healthy or not, and drive them into a predator pit or local extinction. So half the papers say they're good, and half them say wolves are bad. But it's an ecological balance. So what happens is when you cut down the forest and moose move in, then the caribou, you get big wolves, big packs, and caribou are very susceptible to predation, and they disappear. But if you have caribou wolves, and in a caribou situation, then they're beneficial. They're taking out the sick guys and those sorts of guys. So again, there's this balance, ecological balancing thing. So I don't think if you have an area with caribou, the wolves in that area are probably the appropriate size for caribou, and they're on an average beneficial. So I think going in and machine gunning them all like they did in Alaska to choppers, I don't think it's a management strategy that has much value at all. You know, the big thing is the plant changes. If you change the plants, you change the ungulate in the system, the deer in the system, which